Welcome to the third Asia Global Institute Public Policy webinar. I'm Hei-Wai Tang, Associate Director of the Institute. The AGI Public Policy webinar series is a new webinar series organized by the AGI. It aims to bring in leading academics and scholars from universities and think tanks around the world to present current research on global public policy issues and discuss their implications for Asia and the world. The speaker of our public policy webinar today is Professor Danny Quah, the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, as well as the Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics there. Professor Quah is a member of the Spence-Stiglitz Commission on Global Economic Transformation. He was previously Assistant Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and then Professor of Economics and International Development, as well as Director of Saw Swee Hock Southeast Asia Center at the London School of Economics. He has served as LSE's Head of Department of Economics and Council Member on Malaysia's National Economic Advisory Council. His current research takes an economic approach to studying the supply and demand of world order. On the one hand, what international system the world's superpowers can provide, and on the other hand, what world order the global community needs. One can use the model to examine the competition between the great powers and the current state of the world order, and shed light on the role of other nations in the US-China relations. In the first half of today's webinar, Professor Quah will first share his insights based on his book project, Great Power Competition in the Marketplace for World Order. After the first 30 minutes presentation by Professor Quah, there will be a Q&A session moderated by me. During the webinar, please feel free to type questions in the Q&A box. I will try my best to direct your questions to Professor Quah later on. Without further ado, Professor Quah, please.
Thank you, Hei-Wai. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen so that it'll come up in a minute. I am, as Professor Tang says, going to talk about great power rivalry. This obvious great power rivalry, a new way to try and think about this, but great power rivalry obviously is something that economists, international relations scholars, and everybody else is paying attention to from some distance, most of us. We know that it has something to do with US-China geopolitical tensions. We understand that there's the possibility of an ongoing trade and technology war. We understand that it's about competition over technological and political systems. Most of us also have an idea that it has something to do with the international system out there, or world order, or the international rules of the game. Now, all of this seems to me a pretty big development in the world. But as Professor Tang has told you, actually all I am is an economist. And as an economist, I actually realized that all of my training, all of my studies has not provided me any formal tools to think about this very large change in the world. Admittedly, like Professor Tang, I'm a macroeconomist. Like him, I'm interested in international dynamics. I'm interested in growth across nations. And so you would think that an economist who's interested in these large issues ought to have the tools to understand the dynamic effects of large disturbances like US-China geopolitical tensions. Because you know what? Observers who worry about great power rivalry, they worry about the US-China conflict, they all say the outcome for the world hinges importantly on how that geopolitical competition comes out. But here's the thing. 80% of the world lives in neither the United States nor China. Where in the discussion of great power rivalry is the question, what does that 80% of the world want? What is the outcome for the economic prosperity and the well-being of this 80% if different trajectories of great power rivalry emerge? Should the 80% of us who don't live in either the United States or China just sit back and take what comes in the change of world order as great power rivalry continues? In other words, in economics language, should we think of great power rivalry as just an exogenous disturbance that impacts our well-being, or should this 80% exercise agency, be able to do something that would actually affect the outcome? And in thinking about this as an academic economist, the first thing that I thought about was, well, I need a model. And by a model, I don't mean anything fancy with, micro-specified agents, a continuum of agents, each with well-specified informational constraints, nothing like that, nothing fancy. I just want some structure to help me think through basic questions, like when something in the system, that's the international system, that's world order, something in relations between countries changes. What happens to the other things in the system, things that I care about, like economic prosperity or well-being? And in thinking about this, I realized that actually, as I said, I don't have a well-defined standard pull off the shelf model to think about this. So I decided that I figured I had to put something together that was quite simple and straightforward, that not just economists, but other people can plug into as well. But in the model, there is a research question. And that research question is, what is the numerical value of the elasticity of supply in world order? And my job as an economist, as an econometrician, is I want to estimate that value. Why that elasticity of supply, of the supply curve in the international system, why that matters to the earlier large issues that I talk about? Well, this seminar is the answer to that why question. Why that research question I end up with makes sense in thinking about great power rivalry. So this is what I'm going to do. I know that roughly speaking, the international system is not something that I've taught in any macroeconomics course, in any international economics course, but I know that it's the kind of thing that my colleagues in international relations, or Professor Tang's colleagues in international relations when he was at Johns Hopkins, talk about, or my colleagues in economic history talk about. They say the international system is an architecture for the world. That architecture includes the international financial institutions, the IFIs, the World Bank, IMF, WHO, all kinds of UN-based institutions. I also hear that people say the international system, part of it is about the American century. So what the American century is, international relations scholars, political scientists talk about. They say that's a description of the international system of world order being unipolar, there being a single power centered around the United States, unipolar American centrality. And people there talk about its breakdown due to the rise of different large factors, nationalist populism, the emergence of Donald Trump, or the rise in power of what this literature refers to as revisionist states. And when this literature refers to revisionist states, in the hands of many American interlocutors, people like former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, a revisionist state is China. China seeks to revise the international system into a form that's more suitable for itself. Well, right here, I begin to think, here is where, as an economist, all of the rest of us who are not international relations, political science scholars or statesmen in the world might be able to get some traction. So here, we can begin to map out that the international system or world order is being discussed is actually different possibilities. So this slide has way too much information for us to keep track of, but just to very quickly say, off the top of one's head, you can write down 7 different configurations of world order. Okay, and these 7 are not exhaustive, they're not complete. They are, in a mathematical sense, not even a partition of the state space of world order. They're just different possibilities that come to mind. The first of these, what I put down here as number 1, is the one that I think most of us think about as breaking down due to nationalist populism. It's the world order, it's the relation between countries that's characterized by a level playing field. It's the world order that has multilateralism and inclusiveness in it. It's rules-based. It is transparent. Every nation has a place in it. It follows a rules-based way of conduct. It uses international rule of law. It's respectful of national sovereignty. Collectively, it sensibly manages global public goods. That is one world order. But there's also alternative world orders, not just imagined by myself or other writers, but that have occurred in history. A second possible world order is one characterized by simply hegemony, where there's a leader of the world that then dictates to the rest of the world what the rest of the world should do. When that leader of the world is benevolent, we refer to that as a hegemonic system. If that leader of the world was self-seeking and imperialist, we would think possibly of, well, a system of British colonialism. That would be an alternative world order. And as your eye scans across the slide, not to pay too much more attention on it, there are different ways in which different things might pop out at you. Number 5, for instance, way in the top right-hand corner, there's the arbitrary exercise of power. So when Mike Pompeo, America's former Secretary of State, got on the podium and said, we need to look out for revisionist states seeking to undermine the international system, the story that he wants to tell is that the current world system is system number 1, international rule of law. The system that we might be dragged into, possibly, is system number 5, the arbitrary exercise of power, where the powerful prey on the powerless. There's no rule of law. People, states use predatory economics to intimidate their neighbors, and so on. Between these two extremes, there are all different possibilities. I've written down just 7 possibilities here. 7 possibilities are great for international relations scholars to try and work through. For economic thinking, or a way to try and simplify things into a new model of engagement, I pull out of this that a world order is simply a configuration across nations of norms, of conventions, of rules that guide behavior, together with what in economics would be referred to as common knowledge of those rules. Everybody understands that, everybody understands what those rules are. That would be a world order. And so when we today think about a breakdown of the international system into a different configuration, it is the world or great powers choosing between alternative world orders, choosing between a menu that includes that list of 7 plus other possibilities. So in my telling, in this webinar, in the story that we're going to carry forward for the next 15 minutes, world order is an object of choice for multiple players in the system. It is like there's a game form out there, a mechanism out there, and the outcome of that game form is world order, is a particular equilibrium. And for the last 7 decades, the American century, unipolar American centrality, has given us, so the telling goes, number one of those alternative world orders. The question that you and I now face in thinking about great power rivalry, in thinking about the disruption due to Trump, in thinking about the rise of nationalist populism everywhere in the world is, which world order are we going to settle on? Which new world order will emerge? Here's a way to start thinking about it formally. There are different possible geometries of world order. I've put down 3 here. The first possible world order, first possible geometry of world order is on the upper left-hand side. It is a linear hierarchy determined by an axis of power. The more power a nation state has, the higher it is in that hierarchy. So there, in that linear hierarchy of nations, I put a number 1 nation, a number 2 nation, and so on down. And when international relations scholars out there talk about measuring the power of nations, implicitly, what they're thinking about is this axis of power. And what they're trying to do is to think about, well, you know, for the last 7 decades, the American century, America has been the number 1 nation in that hierarchy. Rapidly rising is a number 2 nation. Most observers would say that's China. And then they play games with this axis of power. Those scholars play games with this axis of power. When China approaches 80% along that axis of power, does the Thucydides trap kick in so that there is potentially violent conflict between the number 1 and number 2 nations, the great power, the superpower, and the rising great power, the number 2. That's one possibility. On the extreme right side of this picture, there is a network of nations, and there's nothing like a hierarchy, but these networks form into different clusters. There might be a cluster centered around China or some other great power. There might be a cluster centered around America, some other great power. And then what emerges as this alternative world order is a system of multipolarity. No single pole or center of the international community of nations, but there are multiple poles. A third possibility, which is the one that I am most interested in, which is my model, which is the model I thought about, which is actually every economist's model in the audience, is the third picture that's depicted here, supply and demand. Think about the horizontal axis here being alternative world orders. There are nations, coalitions of nations, who can supply in an upward sloping curve possible world order at ever higher price. And then there's the rest of us, the 80% of the world, who are on the demand side of this, interested in what the suppliers will provide in terms of world order. That is what this talk, the remaining 10 minutes of this talk, is going to be about. World order in a marketplace. World order in a marketplace that identifies supply and demand. I'm back in the game of trying to identify disturbances to supply and demand in the marketplace for world order. And what's of interest to me is whether that supply world order has a slope. Because you see, in economics, we're used to thinking about the players on the demand side as being small, not actually having power, market power. But as a whole, collectively, as articulated in the market demand curve, shocks to them, wishes that they articulate about where they'd like to go, will affect outcomes if the supply world order has a positive slope and is not vertical. It is a positive finite slope. So my research question is, what is the slope of that world order? Because can small nations influence the outcome in world order? So what I do here, what I do in my research, and I won't have time to go into every single detail here, but just to set the stage for our discussion in another 10 minutes or so, what I do is to sketch out some of the ideas that matter here. So 3 things that I do. First is I'm bringing economics into a discussion of world order as described previously. I want to tell you why this is something that some conventional thinking objects to. So what I'm doing in bringing economics into world order is orthogonal to convention. That's the second thing I want to very quickly tell you a little bit about. And then I want to tell you about the research that brings out the slope of the supply schedule, or put it another way, establishes agency for those nations that are not great powers. So if today we think the great powers are the United States and China, and they're locked in G2 competition, they're locked in geostrategic rivalry, my paper is about what the rest of the world should be doing in this new era of great power rivalry. Now, I've only got a few minutes left, so I need to sort of march through this quickly, but that's the setup of what I want to do. Okay. Talk about economics and world order. Well, actually, I've already told you about that. I've told you about how when I began, there were 7 different configurations of world order. All that a world order is an n-tuple of attributes. Here, I have put down 3 possibilities. I've told you how conventional thinking, a lot of work, Lowy Institute, all discussions about power, whether it's about hard power, soft power, all calibrations of collective power, derivative power, intrinsic power, all notions of power are about this first vertical axis, where you line up an axis of power, and you're trying to figure out who is where in that measurement. But my approach is to focus on this bit, the demand and supply for world order. Now, so if I pull that out, what I'm looking at is this picture. And what I want to know is when the demand curve moves about, does it affect the outcome for world order? How do I do that? Well, one way to do that is using econometrics, but then I've got to start thinking, how do I measure world order? Because it's an n-tuple of attributes. It's not just a scalar quantity. So I've got to work a little bit at that. Let me reassure those who, world order is obviously not single dimensional, and the picture can be changed to bring in that multidimensionality. Now, I'm going to get to that in the third part, which is about agency, or the slope of the supply schedule. Let me tell you the objection to what I've just done. For the economists in the audience, you might all be saying, how can this be objectionable? This is economics 101. This is what we all teach our students, whether we teach our students dynamic general equilibrium, stochastic modeling, or whether we teach our students introductory economics. Ultimately, it all comes down to a demand curve and a supply curve. How could this be objectionable? But I'm trying to use economic ideas in a field that's not actually necessarily economics friendly, because international relations likes to think about the power axis, that axis, and standard international relations thinking does not take kindly to this moving into a marketplace idea, because in standard international relations thinking, you've got great powers and you're trying to figure out which great power wins. And from in that thinking on the US side, there's a narrative about how China, it used to be the Soviet Union, okay, when then the great power competition was about the Cold War, but now today it's about US-China geostrategic rivalry. So the narrative that gets brought out is, oh, China is a revisionist power that seeks to undermine world order. It is not a responsible global stakeholder. It's using predatory economics to intimidate its neighbors. BRI is a thinly disguised, thinly veiled trap for debt trap diplomacy, and so on. Okay, and of course, there's the counter narrative that says, well, you know, America no longer shows performance legitimacy. You know, its growth is economic growth is abysmal. It's about 50% of the population has suffered terribly. They've become poorer. Look at how it's managed COVID-19. All of that is about geopolitical, geostrategic competition between number 1 and number 2. And for many international relations scholars and observers, you stop there. You don't have to go further, because why would you want to go beyond that? Kenneth Waltz, the great Harvard political scientist, in 1979 wrote this. He said, look, it's wishful thinking to try and bring in that 80% of the world out there, because it's ridiculous to try and construct a theory of international politics, a theory of world order. Why would you want to reach out and base it on countries like Malaysia or Costa Rica? It's not sensible. What we're talking about here is a sector of the economy where there are large firms engaged in oligopolistic competition, and the other side, everything else that happens in the economy, is not worth talking about. This idea, this realist idea, goes back 2,000 years. Thucydides, who I mentioned earlier for the Thucydides trap, of course, wrote other things as well. One of the things he's written, very famous in this literature, is the strong do what they will. Sometimes it's stated as the strong do what they can. I prefer this version. The strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. So great power rivalry is about great powers. No point bringing in the other 80%. Well, maybe we need to change our minds on this. So remember, Mansur Olsen, one of the great political economists of our era, wrote about how even if you have great powers in the sense of bandits that are roaming the countryside, raping and pillaging on everybody else, at some point, roving bandits become stationary bandits. Why? Because it is more profitable for them to take care of the other 80% than it is just to ride roughshod over them. Bandits will switch from being roaming or roving bandits to stationary bandits. And there's lots of evidence that says why that should be the case. 80% of the world now, I said 80% of the world lives outside the US and China, and that's true. But a democratic majority of the world lives in this tiny circle. This is a tiny circle that's only 1/6 of the world's area. It includes, well, where all of you are in Hong Kong, where I am here in Singapore and Southeast Asia generally, includes India and China. But this, if the world had to organize an election, 50% of the world in a democratic majority would be located here, not in the transatlantic axis, not in the standard G7. The world's center of gravity has steadily drifted east, so that even if Kenneth Waltz and Thucydides were right for the pre-1980 era, since then, the world's economic center is actually here in Asia, where you and I are now sitting. And globalization has lifted all the rest of us over and above what the G7 is. This is a time series graph that shows how, compared to the G7, the emerging markets and developing countries, including China, used to never be more than 30% of their combined GDP of G7, but since 2000, it's now exceeding more than 50%. So all of that says, look, the center of the world has shifted. Even if all of us remain small, we're still more than 50% of the world now. This is where the world's economic center is, including where China is, but even outside of China, that shift continues to occur. So this is where the economic research comes in. What we're interested in this picture of demand and supply, when the demand curve shifts, when this demand curve, downsloping demand curve vibrates, in Bob Hall's terms, it vibrates up and down. Does the supply curve show world order changing? Does this demand curve have agency? So this is where, you know, a more technical research seminar might take off. Let me just do two things. One is tell you about what tell you about what the research is, what the research shows, the tools by which I do the research, and then I'll conclude in time to hand over for the remaining 30 minutes. Okay, so first is, let's not yet do econometrics. Let's not yet do formal modeling. Let's do what international relations or other social sciences do. They do case studies. They say, your research question is about whether small states can affect outcomes. Go look at the history of small states and foreign policy outcomes. Do the actions of small states influence changes? These case studies might show exceptional circumstances, but they give us at least some confidence that when it comes to doing the econometrics, to doing the statistical analysis, to doing the big data type regularities, we'll actually be looking at something that's sensible. So in the time I've got, let me just do two examples. The paper, the book, as Hewa refers to, actually contains dozens of these examples. Let me just do two examples. The first is Nicaragua, small state. It got into an argument with the United States, great power. Who won that argument? Well, we'll remember Nicaragua used to be a big friend of the United States when Somoza ran Nicaragua. And then in the late 1970s, the Sandinistas, revolutionaries, took over Nicaragua, and then they became like America's enemy. America went to the point where it financed the group to invade Nicaragua. What did Nicaragua do? It's a small state. There's no way in which in the axis of power it's going to show up against the United States. What it did was It said, look, the International Court of Justice, America might not respect the International Court of Justice, but I'm going to take my case to the ICJ, because in international law, we are all equal. So Nicaragua, in a series of actions over, under the revolutionary Sandinistas throughout the 80s, ran a series of cases at the International Court of Justice. Among them was one where it sued the United States. It said that what the United States was doing was illegal. The ICJ found for Nicaragua, said that what the US was doing was illegal. The US, like every great power, said, you know what, I don't care. I don't care what the ICJ says, it has no jurisdiction. But the outcome of that was that in the World Court of Global Public Opinion, everybody realized that what the United States was doing was violating norms that it had itself set out in terms of international rule of law. Then, although the US said, I do not respect what the ICJ's rulings are, a few years after that, they became better friends with Nicaragua. Nicaragua, a small state, was able to exercise agency in how the foreign policy of a great power behaved. And it became so famous in the sequence of actions that it became something known as Nicaragua's foreign legal policy. Nicaragua, a small state, practiced agency by going to court, by going to International Court of Justice. I won't go through the Singapore and the Dalian League example. Let me just refer quickly to the Berlin crisis. The Berlin crisis between 1958 and 1961 was a situation where Europe was divided in the Cold War era between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. Germany was the most divided of these states because after the Second World War, the armies that come into Germany settled where they ended, and then Germany was divided into a Soviet side and the Western bloc. Not only that, but Berlin itself, the city, which was contained within the Soviet bloc, was itself further divided into West Berlin and East Berlin. This was not a comfortable position to be in. What the Soviet Union wanted to do under Khrushchev was to work with this system and become friendlier towards the West. East Germany said no. East Germany banged on the table and said, look, this is not a tenable situation. What we need to do is to build a wall. Building walls is a well-established practice of many dictators. East Germany said, we will build a wall between West Berlin and East Berlin. Soviet Union said, no, we don't want to. They'll piss off the Americans. East Germany said, no, we don't care. We're going to do that. And they went ahead and eventually persuaded the Soviet Union to do that. So there are dozens of examples of this where small states have influenced big power. So what I'm talking about is where small states underlying the demand curve shifting about has influenced the actions on the supply side. Econometrically, that's a large but identifiable question. Many decades ago, as Haywire was nice enough to refer to with Olivier Blanchard, I wrote a paper called Identifying Demand and Supply Disturbances in Aggregate Fluctuations. This is something very different, of course, but it's come down to the same thing. I'm trying to identify demand shocks in the market for world order. And I'm doing that using big data on UN General Assembly voting, waves of foreign policy coherence. I've run out of time. Thank you all so much for your patience. Let me conclude. I've told you about the project that I'm doing. This brings economics into discussions in international relations. It does so in a way that's orthogonal to many conventional thinking, not all. There are many international relations scholars who are friendly towards this way of thinking, but it's not necessarily conventional. And I've told you about two items of research. One, historical case studies. Second, a big data kind of approach to studying UN general voting records to try and identify the impact of demand disturbances. My key conclusions are also three. I have recast the traditional thinking about great power rivalry from just what's happening to number one and number two, which is a more traditional way of thinking, to a market equilibrium idea. There's a demand curve and there's a supply curve. And what the outcome is a market clearing equilibrium. And I've told you about empirical research that's meant to uncover the degree of agency, or in economics language, the elasticity of supply with respect to demand shocks in world order. Now, this is just the big, this is a small part of a large project. You know, world order also has many other interesting issues that include what's happening with global public goods that are not necessarily captured by just the market and marketplace paradigm. And so that will be brought in together with other externalities. Now, I've run over time by a few minutes. Hey, why I apologize to you and the audience for that, but let me turn this back to you now, if I may.
Thank you so much, Professor Quah, for the insightful discussion. And I should apologize for imposing a 30-minute restriction on you. It obviously seems to be more like a 1-hour presentation. And I'm glad that there are already quite some questions in the Q&A box, which actually will allow you to elaborate some of the stuff that I'm sure you want to elaborate further. But as a moderator, let me ask the first couple of questions. The first one is, it's great to see an economic framework for us to understand and interpret some of the world order pressing global geopolitical questions. I used to teach microeconomics to my students at Johns Hopkins sites, and once in a while I would talk about some of the discussions that you just made. And a key model that I usually would try to connect to is in what situation or under what situations that we will see countries to form collusion or cartel. I still remember, two very successful and sustainable cartels include OPEC, which is a bunch of countries that produce oil, as well as the copper cartel under the leadership of Chile. And I would explain to them that the characteristics of these two cartels or collusions is that the distribution of natural resources is uneven. Usually with a few countries that sort of are endowed with more resources than the others. And on the other hand, for the cartels to be successful, you need leadership. Obviously, in the case of OPEC, Saudi Arabia, and in the case of copper cartel, Chile. So in your small state agency argument, how should we think about the distribution of resources as well as who is going to provide the leadership if it is not coming from the superpowers?
Okay, thank you, thank you. If I may, let me pick up on this first. And I know you said you had other questions, but if I may take this one first. Thinking about it as a cartel is exactly the right way to think about this. But I might take it further and we think about not just cartels, but coalitions. Or in the case of consumers, a consumer union. Consumers can group together and then, together as a group, exercise buying power that's greater than what each individual can utilize. The internet or the app, the Groupon app, that allows people to gather together and exercise or articulate a demand for a certain good to try and bring about a discount price that they can then distribute to everyone would also be another example in the realm of economics. In the realm of foreign policy and international relations, I think of these coalitions as being possibly ASEAN or the European Union. Or actually, even what used to be NAFTA, which is now, of course, no longer exists, but something else, groupings that gather together so that they can see the economic benefits to what they've put together, but at the same time are able to exercise a geopolitical footprint. So not so much NAFTA, which never took a geopolitical position, but the European Union, and in a way, ASEAN itself. ASEAN brings together 10 nation states that together grouped into almost 700 million people, one of the world's largest economic blocs, the world's fastest significant growth bloc, is now able to exercise market power in a way that by itself, a nation like Singapore, which is much smaller, might not be able to. So I think those are nice examples. I'm glad you brought that up. But the magic of economics is, of course, that consumers can affect the marketplace even when they don't get together into groupings, even when they behave as price takers. Their behavior, shocks to their preferences, will shift the demand curve and will influence market outcomes, not as effectively as when they group together, but it will still influence market outcomes. See, Economics 101 tells us that even in market perfectly competitive price-taking behavior agents, demand curves and supply curves are not flat, are not horizontal. They shift in response to shocks.
Great. I do have a second question, but in the interest of time, and I should be very fair to all the other participants, let me go through the questions in the Q&A room in my own capacity. So the first question by Andy Tao is, with the recent initiatives from the US towards global minimum corporate tax that may gain political traction with the possible inclusion of key G20 economies, would this not be taken as an economic retaliation from the US and perhaps European nations against Asia on the pretext of supporting its need to reinvest or reinvent itself after the mismanagement of the previous government?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Yeah. Thank you, Andy, for that very interesting question. Because as you know, most of the narrative in the Western press is completely blind to this issue, to this geopolitical consideration that you brought in. A lot of that discussion is about how having a minimum corporate tax worldwide to be exercised anywhere in the world. For them, they say, oh, well, it levels the playing field. It allows nation states to no longer have companies sort of chase towards the lowest common denominator, chase towards the lowest common denominator, move to jurisdictions that are unwilling to tax these corporate giants. So it levels the playing field, and it also helps level the income distribution, because all the very rich people who are making use of these tax havens will no longer be allowed to do so, and it brings industry back to a West that wants to become great again. Most evident in the U.S. rhetoric on making America great again. And there's lots to recommend for that for those who are more liberal thinking, because they say, well, this is a way to keep the top 1% from running away from everybody else. Your point is an excellent one. Whatever might happen with that, it discriminates against other nations who are also desperately trying to climb the stages of economic development. And it removes economic comparative advantage that they might have. They are willing to tolerate large corporate giants doing their business here because there are other payoffs to that here, not from taxation. And by doing that, it makes the corporate giants no longer view these as distinct comparative advantage. This is an excellent point. Whether the rest of Asia sort of unifies around this idea at this stage remains to be seen. We need to go out there and make people more aware that at the same time that there's a decrease in inequality from these actions within the West itself, there will tend to be a fracturing, a worsening of income inequality across the world, because this actually makes the playing field not level, because there are other advantages that the developed West is already able to play. So I agree with you. This is an excellent point. We should be making an argument together that says that this is not an appropriate way to conduct business. Business needs to play according to the rules of the game that every nation needs to be included on. So let me leave it at that. Back to you, Hei-Wai.
Great. Let me move on to the next question, which is also related to a question that I really wanted to ask earlier. Question is by NC Han. How do we know which international order we are in? Very deep question. Surely different people have different take on the current order as inclusive, multilateral, or hegemonic, or others.
Yeah.
The perception of whether the US-led order is benign is subject to interpretation by different audiences. Obviously, after the Trump's administration, some people may think that the US has already retreated quite a bit from multilateralism. If there's no consensus, how can people choose?
Yeah. Oh, that's an excellent question, Nancy. You know, when I used to, okay, so I try and tell the story in terms of, you know, idealized examples. So in the best possible case, if we believe the American narrative on the American century, on what it itself, or Joseph and I calls the American century, it created a multilateral, transparent, inclusive system. It allowed everybody to participate. It flattened the playing field by its openness to trade. It allowed our nations in East Asia to develop through leveraging large markets in the West. And it brought into the idea that, you know, there were international rules of the game that no one should be taken advantage of if they were small. Now, when I tell this to Latin American students, they laugh because they say the United States of America has never done any of these things as far as they're concerned. And look at how America has behaved in the Middle East and other places, other parts of the world. A lot to be said that it did not respect its own ideals. But your point, and Hei-Wai, you put this really well, when Trump pulled back on a lot of this, we could say even the good things that were in that imperfect model are now no longer available. We can agree that it's pulled back from that. We might disagree on how ideal that system was, but we'll agree that what is pulled back on makes the system even less ideal. Now, there's no way, I mean, there are rules of the game. One of my colleagues here at the Lee Kuan Yew School has written a book on delineating what they are. We have to agree that there's some common denominator, and then around the fringes, there's a gray area. But I think most of us would think of the last 7 decades as being an era of multilateralism, not universally so, and in some places rather badly practiced, but it was a good era. I think what's more interesting in your question is not that we can't identify the exact parameters of that, but even if we can, we still disagree. You know, the model number one, multilateralism, inclusiveness, that for many readers now, they will disagree with the idea that, well, couldn't we improve on the situation by setting up bilateral win-win transactions, bilateral outcomes that would be excluded in a multilateral system? What's wrong with that? We have not exhausted the gains from exchange in the multilateral system that we could extract more of in a more bilateral transactional approach to relations between nations. So we can disagree about those. Their practice will not be ideal, but we can disagree about what the ideals are and give us some traction about which direction to go. You know, like many other things, the marketplace model should not be taken literally. At the end of it all, even when we establish an outcome, you know, we will never know what that exact point is, but we have some idea of which neighborhood it is. And I think that's all we can aim for. Back to you, please.
Bernard Laponte asked a question, and I wonder as well. And he is curious whether you can say a little bit more about your econometric exercise that you just mentioned.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. So, you know, what the UN voting records indicate is when different groupings implicitly form. So unlike what Hei-Wai and I were talking about earlier, where there are official cartels forming, if you think about the concordance of votes taken in the UN General Assembly, over time, these concordances and coherences fluctuate. So quantifying the concordance of different groupings that go in a certain direction, and then trying to disentangle what the causes are for the changes in these concordances. Are the causes something that emerged from a discussion that a small state initiated? Is it something that benefited a small state because of a change in circumstances? When Singapore initiated an entire discussion on law of the sea and then worked together with different groupings within the United Nations to make that come about, can we trace through the econometrics, those kinds of occurrences? So that's the econometrics exercise that I'm after.
All right, so there's still a lot of questions, and I think Professor Quah, you already answered some of them indirectly. So to the audience, I'm skipping some of them. Hope you don't mind. Let me jump on to the question by Professor Kelly Tsai, who is a dean at the HKUST Social Science. She said about market clearing equilibrium, and she wonders how the equilibrium of the world order would look like. Yeah. And she further elaborated, ideal typical laissez-faire markets have historically given rise to the regulatory state since third-party enforcement of contracts is needed. What types of supranational institutions are realistic in terms of having binding authority?
Okay, thank you, AY, for telling me, alerting me to Kelly's question. Hi, Kelly. We met a few days ago on a different Zoom telephone call. Very good to see you again. Your question is spot on. As an economist, I run right to the model of market clearing, and I go past what many economic historians think of as the emergence of institutional structures, rule of law, that help maintain that marketplace. And my thinking on this is that those institutional structures will emerge endogenously when great powers, coalitions of nations, and others see that it's in their interest to maintain that outcome. Hence my reference earlier to Mansur Olson's thinking on the difference between a roving bandit and a stationary bandit. The reason that rule of law emerged in modern world history was because players in the game saw it in their incentive to devise a system of rule of law and then support it. That's the idea of the stationary bandit. Rule of law within nations did not emerge because there was an earlier law that said you had to have rule of law. Rule of law is something that emerges endogenously. And a large part of what the research will have to go on to do is to try and understand what you refer to as supranational mechanisms that would emerge endogenously, in my view, or that in other views, in legal scholars' views, need to be worked on that would allow supporting this metaphorical marketplace. Having said that, I already think that we've got a lot of that structure in place already. In the earlier system of rule of law, in the system of understanding of international trade. And it's a small step from there to having to be able to bring in the kind of marketplace ideas that I want to conceptualize. Where you've also got spot on is that this marketplace will not achieve an outcome that is the best outcome, because there will still be global public goods and externalities that the marketplace does not capture. And for that, we're going to need additional institutions, perhaps institutions of the kind that the American century tried to build that would seek to manage these global public goods externalities spillovers. In fact, Haywai, Kelly, we're in the midst of one. The global pandemic was exactly, an instance where a global public good needed to be maintained, and nations completely failed at the job. So we clearly, we thought that, World Health Organization that we had built might be part of the structure that would help us support a cooperative outcome. It turns out that its legislation, the rules under which it operates, does not allow it to do that. And the rest of us, all other nations, completely failed to capitalize on the opportunity to be cooperative. Through all of this time, the great powers continued their sniping at each other, and nations became very individual-oriented, inward-looking. Vaccine diplomacy emerged as a result of that, and none of that bodes well. So actually, I realize I'm arguing your case rather than mine now, because this is an instance where the institutions actually blatantly did not emerge endogenously. So that's an excellent point, Kelly. I hope that you and I will have opportunity to discuss these issues further.
Professor Quah, do you mind to answer 2 more questions? Which
Certainly,
means
yeah.
you have to stay behind, unfortunately, for 2 more minutes, because there are lots of very good questions that I myself also couldn't think of. This one by Kuan, about 10 years ago, he remembered that you presented your research about economic center of gravity. He would like to know what you think right now after the trade war. Did it decelerate the movement of the world's economic center?
Okay, thank you. Excellent question. I'm actually redoing that calculation, and I hope that, you know, in a few weeks I'll be able to say precisely what I'm now going to say as a conjecture. So, you know, yes, 10 years ago I did the calculation about the world shift in the economic center of gravity, and what I had done was I chopped up the world into cities, and I considered each city as a mass point of economic value, and I asked how fluctuations in economic value were changing the international geo-economic landscape. And the discovery there, as you've repeated, is that the world's economic center used to be transatlantic, and then over the years that I was doing the study, it steadily drifted east towards where you and I actually are. In 2015, the Economist newspaper redid my calculations and confirmed that my projection that around that time, the world's economic center would be in the Middle East was actually borne out. It actually was there, not because all economic activity was in the Middle East, but because that was the balance between Asia and the transatlantic region. Now, my conjecture, given the way the world has been for the last 5-10 years, is that we're going to see a speeding up of the shift of the world's economic center of gravity towards us in GMT plus 8. And I say this for a number of reasons. America, every now and then, gets a sugar boost in its stock market. Donald Trump provided such a sugar boost, infrastructure spending, government spending, every now and then, relaxation of corporate taxes, give a boost to the stock market. The hope always been, for those of us who studied under Olivier Blanchard, hope always been is that the Q model, when the stock market rises, that pulls along the rest of the economy. America's growth has not been organic in that way. America's very poorest, the bottom 50%, continue to languish. A lot of that stock market wealth has shown up in just the very top 1 or top 0.01% of the population. Growth is not organic. In the course of this trade war, China's consumer market has grown manyfold. Many Asian economies have held together well over the course of both the trade war and the coronavirus pandemic. The seeds for growth in Asia continue to be strong. So my conjecture is we're seeing a speed up of this drift of the world's economic center of gravity towards us in GMT plus 8, and it will accelerate to reach us well before 2048, which was the time I predicted 10 years ago it would be here by. We will see that here before 2048 is my current forecast. Thank you for your question.
Let me change a little bit by combining the last 2 questions into one. The question is about Biden. So in your talk, you have repeatedly mentioned Donald Trump, but how about Biden's new strategy towards American competitiveness in the 21st century and interest in engaging allies across the world?
Yeah.
And a combined question that I would like to add is, in 5 years, who do you see will be the global leader in the new world order, China or the United States? Okay,
excellent questions to end this with. Although, as you will suspect, I'm not going to answer that last question. I'm just going to waffle about. But in terms of what's happening with Biden, spot on. You know, Biden has in the month of March signed 2 $1.9 trillion congressional spending bills, one for recovery from coronavirus, second on infrastructure spending. These are massive infusions of fiscal finance into the American system. Exactly as you say, he's become friendlier, building towards sort of rebuilding relations on allies. He's rejoined the Paris Climate Accords. You know, he's rejoining the World Trade Organization. Will say nice things about World Health Organization. Is coming back to be a responsible global stakeholder, which we had always thought America was. And all those things are very positive. However, I also think he's on a good run. How long will that continue? Let's see what his support is. The American people, 81 million Americans voted for Biden. That's wonderful, record number. But 74 million voted for Donald Trump. 74 million Americans, even after all of the disastrous COVID-19 mismanagement, the disastrous last 4 years of US administration, 74 million Americans still think America's on the right track. And why do they think that? They think he's on the right track because it views China as an enemy. Whatever else you might want to do, the Trumpism, the trail of Trumpism that's continued is Trumpism, is a view of America that says there are enemies in the world and there's a limit to how much we want to be cooperative and collaborative with them. America is not coming back to the American century. Part of what made America great was the American century. So I think that, yes, America is on a good trajectory, but I would say watch this space because a lot of America remains Trumpian. Trump had a personality that was random and destructive. He injected shocks and disturbances into the global system. Biden won't do that. But in a sense, Biden is even more deliberate in how he carries forward the American narrative. Because now Biden will lecture China and the rest of the world on human rights, on Western-style liberal democracy, on free speech, on a range of other things, that Asia as a whole says, well, you know, we've got other challenges, other economic challenges that we're dealing with. This is not something that is central on our menu of worries right now. So I think Biden will find that he's not completely in step with the rest of the world either. Now, on your last question, who is going to be the leader of the world? I think that discussion is in the linear axis of power discussion. We're looking at who is number one and number two. That's hugely interesting. I have no insight on that. I'm interested in the marketplace model, which is how does the rest of the world convince the leaders of the world to get to a better place for all of the world, not just for the top two nations, but for the 80% of us who live elsewhere as well. And I hope that this research or this way of thinking is something that allows all the rest of us to exercise agency in how world order, in what the new world order emerges to be. Thank you for that excellent question.
Thank you so much, Professor Quah. Your answer to the last two questions summarized today's webinar very well. We all learned that there's a marketplace for world order, demand and supply, and at the same time, small states and their agencies matter. These are all what we learned today, and thank you so much for your engaging, insightful presentation and sharing. I have a question. When will your book be out?
I will. As economists, we're torn because we know that writing books is just one item in Google Scholar, whereas writing technical papers can get us much more in terms of H's and I-10s and all the rest of this. So there's a constant tension, but fingers crossed, both of those trajectories will be on the table soon. Unfortunately, I now have to go back to being dean for the rest of the day. So all that writing and research will have to stop for the rest of the day.
We all look forward to your book to come out, and I'm sure many of us will purchase a copy. Thank you. Let me promote the next event and talk a little bit about AGI for the last minute. So the next public policy webinar is going to be given by Professor David Lambton, who is a senior fellow of Johns Hopkins Science Foreign Policy Institute. For those of you who have been studying, reading about US-China relations, Professor Lambton is no stranger. Next, please. And most importantly, please follow us on different social media platforms. We have a weekly Asia Global online article published under the leadership of Professor Al Rees. It touched on all sort of global geopolitical economic issues, and we are on LinkedIn, Twitter, and obviously YouTube. For example, later today, we're going to post Professor Quah's sharing on our social media platforms. All right, that's it for today. Thanks again, Professor Quah. We all learned a lot. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much, Professor Tang. Thank you to the Institute for hosting me. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you all so much.